You don't get to build a national brand on compassion and then refuse to answer for the damage done in its name, Ted Cruz said quietly. And in that instant, the hearing room stopped behaving like a stage and started feeling like a reckoning. The line did not sound angry or theatrical or even triumphant, which is why it landed so hard. Some people watching immediately asked why Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was being challenged so directly. Why now? And why in a way that felt less like debate and more like exposure? The reason matters, and it is not partisan, which is why you should stay with this all the way to the end. Because this moment explains how modern power hides behind morality, and why that protection is beginning to fail. Before the narrative hardens, I need to be explicit about my own position so you understand how to read what follows without being pulled by performance. This is not an attempt to demonize Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, nor is it an effort to canonize Ted Cruz. It is an examination of two competing models of political legitimacy, one built on urgency, symbolism, and moral certainty, the other grounded in constraint, consequence, and institutional memory. Both models claim to serve working people, and both can sound persuasive in isolation. The question is, which one survives governing without externalizing harm? The House Committee on Economic Policy hearing room was filled well beyond its official capacity, and that detail mattered more than most viewers realized. Crowds change behavior, especially in politics, where the presence of an audience quietly rewrites incentives. C-SPAN cameras were locked into their standard angles, wide shots to honor the institution, close-ups to capture emotion, because emotion is what carries online. Reporters from every major network occupied the press section, fingers already hovering over keyboards, drafting stories they believed they understood before the first exchange unfolded. The room was primed for affirmation, not interrogation. The gallery itself reflected the fault line running through the country. On one side sat young progressive activists, energized, confident, fluent in the language of justice and redistribution, ready to cheer moral clarity. On the other sat small business owners and older constituents, quieter, less practiced in spectacle, carrying the fatigue of people who have learned that policy debates rarely include their aftermath. Both groups believed they were the ones being ignored. Both were correct in different ways. At the witness table sat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, still one of the most recognizable figures in American politics. No longer new, but still dominant in the public imagination. Her presentation was carefully calibrated, professional without stiffness, relatable without informality, every detail signaling command rather than defensiveness. The confidence was earned, reinforced by years of media attention that rewards clarity and punishes hesitation. When she spoke, people listened not only because of her words, but because of what she represented. Symbolic power, once established, becomes a form of authority. Across the room sat Ted Cruz, less animated, less expressive, but no less intentional. He carried himself like someone who had prepared for resistance rather than applause. The stack of folders on his desk looked ordinary, but their neat alignment suggested a methodical approach rather than improvisation. He had not come to win a viral moment. He had come to test whether the narrative in front of him could survive contact with constraint. When the chairman called the hearing to order, the formality felt almost ceremonial against the emotional undercurrent already present. Opening statements in Congress are typically performative, and this one began exactly as expected. Ocasio-Cortez rose, arranged her papers, and launched into a speech that framed economics as a moral system rather than a neutral mechanism. She spoke of inequality as an indictment, not a condition, describing a nation where wealth had surged upward while wages stagnated below. The language was forceful, and the frustration it echoed was real. She described billionaires growing richer during crisis, corporations exploiting loopholes, and working families absorbing the shock. She offered solutions with certainty: federal job guarantees, universal health care, tuition-free education, aggressive climate investment. Each proposal was framed not as an experiment, but as an overdue correction. Applause broke the procedural rules of the room, and the gavel's attempt to restore order felt symbolic rather than effective. Momentum gathered quickly, as it often does when moral clarity meets media amplification. As she spoke, something subtle but critical was happening. The media began locking in a frame that assumed affirmation rather than scrutiny. Supporters leaned forward, expecting validation of beliefs they already held. But on the opposite side of the gallery, faces tightened, not in hostility, but in recognition of cost. That tension would become unavoidable. When Cruz stood, the contrast was immediate. He did not mirror her energy, because mirroring would have ceded ground. Instead, he slowed the room down, acknowledging her passion without endorsing her conclusions. He complemented the rhetoric just enough to disarm, then began narrowing the frame. This was not about whether inequality exists, he said, but about whether proposed remedies obey the laws of human behavior. He asked foundational questions, deliberately simple, because simplicity under pressure exposes gaps more effectively than complexity. What happens when you tax an activity? He asked, not rhetorically, but as if inviting a classroom response. The question hung in the air, uncomfortable precisely because it was difficult to evade without sounding evasive. Incentives, he argued, operate regardless of belief. People adjust behavior not out of ideology, but out of survival. Ocasio-Cortez hesitated briefly, then responded with nuance, context, and caveats, all reasonable in isolation. But Cruz persisted, gently insisting that adaptation does not wait for moral permission. Tax behavior heavily, and behavior changes. Not because people are immoral, but because systems reward survival before virtue. This was not conservatism, he suggested. It was anthropology. The room grew quieter as the exchange shifted from values to mechanics. Applause evaporated, replaced by attention. This was no longer a rally, and it was no longer a takedown. It was a collision between urgency and constraint, between moral speed and structural resistance. That collision is where real political credibility is made or lost. Nothing decisive had happened yet. No argument had collapsed, but the terms of judgment had begun to change. And once power is forced to answer not for intention but for consequence, there is no easy way back. The temperature in the room did not rise, it stabilized, and that was far more dangerous. When debates cool instead of explode, it usually means the participants have stopped performing for the crowd and started measuring consequences. Ted Cruz sensed that shift and leaned into it, not with aggression, but with compression, narrowing the conversation until only pressure points remained. He understood that sprawling arguments favor ideology, while confined questions favor accountability. This was where power either clarifies itself or begins to fracture. Cruz reframed the discussion away from what policies promise and toward what they incentivize. He spoke about incentives, the way an engineer speaks about load-bearing structures, indifferent to intention and unmoved by sentiment. Systems, he argued, do not respond to hope. They respond to pressure. People do not behave as they wish they would under ideal conditions, but as they must under constraint. Ignoring that reality does not make a policy humane. It makes it brittle. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez responded by emphasizing urgency, not as a rhetorical device, but as a diagnosis. She argued that delay entrenches suffering and that incrementalism has become a luxury for those insulated from consequence. In her framing, waiting is not neutral. It is a decision that benefits existing power structures. She spoke of healthcare systems that bankrupt families, housing markets that lock out workers, and wages that no longer track productivity. These were not abstractions, and no one in the room treated them as such. What changed the tone was not disagreement, but convergence. Both sides accepted that the status quo was failing large portions of the population. The fault line emerged over method, not motive. Cruz acknowledged systemic breakdowns without contest, a move that disarmed expectations of dismissal. He conceded that markets can fail and that government intervention can be justified, but only under conditions that respect feedback and correction. He introduced a concept rarely rewarded in modern political theater: error tolerance. Small policies that fail, he argued, can be reversed. Large policies that fail tend to entrench themselves, because admitting failure at scale becomes politically radioactive. When the cost of reversal exceeds the cost of continuation, even broken systems persist. This is how temporary measures harden into permanent burdens. The room reacted unevenly to this framing. Some listeners leaned forward, recognizing the logic even if they disliked the implication. Others recoiled, interpreting caution as a veneer for obstruction. But the argument refused to fit neatly into partisan expectation. It was not a rejection of ambition, it was a warning about irreversibility. Ocasio-Cortez challenged the premise by attacking the assumptions behind predictive models. She argued that economic forecasts often encode ideological bias, undervaluing growth effects and overstating risk. History, she said, is filled with moments when bold intervention reshaped what was previously considered impossible. Social security, Medicare, and public infrastructure were all dismissed as unrealistic before becoming foundational. Her point landed, because pessimism has its own distortions. Cruz did not dispute the examples, but he reframed their relevance. Those programs, he noted, were introduced in contexts where demographic ratios, global competition, and fiscal baselines were fundamentally different. What worked in one era does not automatically scale into another without distortion. The danger, he suggested, lies in treating precedent as proof rather than context. History informs, but it does not guarantee replication. This exchange marked a subtle but critical shift. The debate was no longer about whether bold policy can work, but about who absorbs the cost when it does not. Cruz pressed this asymmetry relentlessly. When ambitious programs misfire, he argued, the burden does not fall evenly. Those with capital, mobility, and networks adapt, while those without flexibility absorb the shock. This was not framed as moral accusation, but as structural reality. Systems cushion those closest to leverage, not because of conspiracy, but because leverage bends systems. Ignoring that dynamic, he warned, risks turning progressive ambition into regressive outcome. If the most vulnerable pay the price of experimentation, certainty becomes cruelty. The room grew quieter as that implication settled. Ocasio-Cortez attempted to reclaim narrative control by returning to scale. Small interventions, she argued, cannot meet structural crises. Climate risk, healthcare collapse, and intergenerational inequality were converging emergencies that demanded speed and magnitude. In her framing, fragility was not created by policy, but by delay. Waiting for perfect design, she warned, guarantees failure through inaction. Cruz responded with a question that did not seek applause. Should speed excuse fragility? Should policies built quickly be expected to repair quickly when they misfire? And does government, once expanded, possess a credible mechanism for retreat? The questions lingered because history offered few reassuring answers. At this point, the hearing had lost its performative rhythm entirely. Sound bites dissolved into silence. The media slowed, sensing that complexity does not clip well. This was no longer a confrontation meant to dominate headlines. It was an exposure of governing philosophy under stress. Cruz emphasized that restraint is not the enemy of compassion, but its discipline. Without limits, he argued, compassion expands until it collapses under its own weight. Governance is an exercise in trade-offs, not absolutes. Every benefit carries a cost. Every protection imposes a boundary. Refusing to name those boundaries does not eliminate them. It only obscures who collides with them first. Ocasio-Cortez listened more than she spoke now, her posture shifting from command to calculation. She understood that the critique was not personal, but structural. Structural critiques are harder to counter because they implicate outcomes beyond intention. The room sensed that shift, even if it could not articulate it. The debate had moved from performance to durability. Nothing had resolved. No side had collapsed. But the terms of legitimacy were changing. This was no longer about who sounded more compassionate, but about whose framework could survive consequence. And once that question enters the room, it does not leave quietly. What made the exchange unsettling was not that either side appeared unprepared, but that both were suddenly operating in a space where certainty became a liability. The hearing room had crossed an invisible threshold, one where slogans lose their protective value and frameworks are forced to account for friction. This is the moment modern politics tries hardest to avoid, because friction exposes who carries risk and who merely narrates it. Ted Cruz understood this instinctively and began shifting the conversation toward the machinery that converts moral language into governing power. That machinery is rarely examined in public, precisely because it functions best when invisible. He began speaking not about legislation, but about alignment. Policies, he argued, succeed or fail not on intention, but on whether the incentives they create align with the behavior they assume. When alignment exists, systems reinforce themselves. When it does not, enforcement expands, costs rise, and legitimacy erodes. This is how well-meaning programs quietly mutate into bureaucratic obligations divorced from outcomes. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez countered by emphasizing that alignment cannot be left to markets that profit from imbalance. She argued that power rarely relinquishes itself voluntarily, and that misalignment is often engineered rather than accidental. In her framing, incentive failure is not a neutral outcome, but the result of political capture. Corporations shape rules to preserve advantage, and then invoke efficiency when challenged. That critique resonated because it reflected a lived reality many people recognize. But Cruz pressed deeper, not denying capture, but expanding the scope of responsibility. He argued that once the state becomes the primary allocator of outcomes, it inherits the same vulnerabilities to capture, only at a larger scale. The question, he said, is not whether power corrupts, but how much power you are willing to concentrate before corruption becomes catastrophic. Decentralized failure is painful, but containable. Centralized failure is elegant, decisive, and devastating. The room shifted again, this time toward unease. Centralization is often framed as efficiency, but efficiency without redundancy is fragility. Cruz framed government not as an evil, but as a force multiplier, capable of amplifying both competence and error. When that multiplier is attached to certainty rather than humility, the consequences accelerate. This was not a partisan warning. It was a systems warning. Ocasio-Cortez responded by reframing centralization as coordination rather than control. She argued that fragmented systems fail precisely because they diffuse responsibility. When no one is accountable, injustice persists by default. Large-scale coordination, in her view, is not about domination, but about coherence. Without it, crises metastasize across jurisdictions while leaders argue about scope. The tension between these positions was no longer ideological, but architectural. One side viewed scale as a prerequisite for justice. The other viewed scale as a multiplier of risk. Neither position was absurd, and that is what made the conflict unresolved. The hearing had evolved into a debate about how much uncertainty a society can tolerate in pursuit of moral aims. At this point, the role of media began to matter in a way most viewers never consciously notice. Cameras had stopped searching for reaction shots. Producers, sensing complexity, resisted cutting away. This was not content optimized for virality, but for credibility. And credibility, once introduced, changes the incentives of everyone involved. Cruz began discussing how narratives harden into orthodoxy. Once a policy becomes a moral symbol, questioning it becomes heresy. At that stage, feedback is interpreted as sabotage rather than information. Systems stop learning not because data disappears, but because dissent becomes reputationally expensive. That, he argued, is when policy stops serving people and starts serving itself. Ocasio-Cortez bristled slightly at this characterization, pushing back against what she saw as a false equivalence. She argued that moral clarity is necessary to overcome institutional inertia. Without it, entrenched interests simply outweigh reformers. There are moments, she insisted, when hesitation is indistinguishable from complicity. History, she said, does not reward moderation in the face of injustice. Cruz did not dispute the moral impulse, but he challenged the operational outcome. He argued that movements built on urgency often struggle with durability. When momentum slows, they lack mechanisms for course correction that do not feel like betrayal. The result is escalation rather than refinement. This is how movements lose allies without realizing it. The room absorbed this exchange in near silence. What was unfolding was not a victory or defeat, but an exposure of trade-offs most politicians prefer to keep abstract. The audience was no longer choosing sides, but recalibrating expectations. This was governance stripped of theater. And stripped of theater, power looks far less certain. Cruz then shifted toward the psychological dimension of modern politics. He argued that constant crisis framing exhausts public trust. When every issue is existential, citizens lose the ability to prioritize. Over time, urgency becomes noise, and noise breeds disengagement. This is how societies drift from participation into cynicism. Ocasio-Cortez countered that disengagement is already here, driven by decades of unfulfilled promises. People are not exhausted by urgency, she argued, but by betrayal. The choice is not between calm and crisis, but between managed decline and deliberate transformation. In her view, the risk of doing too little far outweighs the risk of doing too much. That calculus defines her entire political philosophy. By now, it was clear that neither side was speaking past the other. They were speaking through different definitions of harm. One prioritized the harm of delay. The other prioritized the harm of collapse. This is the fault line that defines modern governance debates far more than party labels. As the exchange drew toward its midpoint, the emotional temperature remained controlled but heavy. There were no eruptions, no gasps, no applause. What lingered instead was the weight of unresolved consequence, the kind that follows policy long after cameras turn away. And that weight, once acknowledged, cannot be unseen. What became unmistakable as the exchange unfolded was that the real audience was no longer the committee, but the institutions listening quietly behind it. Every sentence now carried an afterlife beyond the room, rippling through staff briefings, editorial meetings, donor calls, and internal memos written later that night. This is how power actually registers debate, not as persuasion, but as signal. Who flinches, who escalates, who reframes, and who chooses silence are all noted with professional precision. The spectacle is secondary. The data is everything. At this stage, both men were no longer debating policy, but negotiating narrative boundaries. Each understood that conceding even a narrow premise would be interpreted as weakness by allies and opponents alike. Politics at this altitude is less about winning arguments than about preventing frameworks from hardening against you. Once a framework sticks, facts stop mattering. Only alignment does. Cruz leaned into a question that felt deceptively simple, asking whether moral urgency justifies procedural shortcuts. The phrasing was careful, almost clinical, designed to sound less accusatory than diagnostic. He framed shortcuts not as corruption, but as stress fractures that appear when institutions are pushed faster than they can adapt. Stress fractures do not always cause immediate collapse. They weaken load-bearing points quietly until failure becomes inevitable. Ocasio-Cortez responded by reframing procedure itself as a product of power. She argued that many safeguards were designed not to protect fairness, but to slow disruption. In her view, procedure often functions as a gatekeeping mechanism, selectively enforced to preserve existing hierarchies. When marginalized groups are told to wait for process, what they are often being told is to wait indefinitely. That, she argued, is not neutrality. It is preservation. This exchange exposed a paradox few politicians address honestly. Procedures exist to prevent abuse, but they can also prevent correction. Urgency can produce recklessness, but delay can entrench injustice. There is no algorithmic solution to this tension, only judgment, and judgment carries risk. The audience sensed that both were circling a shared discomfort. Each side feared different outcomes, but both feared losing legitimacy. Legitimacy is the only currency that survives power transitions. Without it, even correct decisions rot on contact. This is why neither side fully committed to absolutes. The conversation then drifted toward the role of media as an accelerant. Cruz argued that outrage-driven coverage compresses nuance into binaries. Once compressed, those binaries become weapons. Policymakers are forced to choose between distortion and silence. Neither option serves the public interest. Ocasio-Cortez countered that media attention is often the only leverage reformers possess. Silence favors incumbency. Exposure forces accountability, even if imperfect. The real danger, she argued, is not outrage, but normalization of harm through underreporting. If injustice is quiet, it becomes invisible. At this point, a subtle shift occurred. The discussion moved away from intention and toward consequence. Not what leaders believe they are doing, but what their actions reliably produce. This is where idealism meets entropy, and entropy does not negotiate. Cruz introduced the idea of institutional memory loss. He argued that rapid cycles of crisis erode long-term learning, When every administration dismantles the last, systems forget why constraints existed in the first place. Mistakes are repeated with new justifications and fresher rhetoric. The result is oscillation, not progress. Ocasio-Cortez acknowledged the risk, but rejected the premise that continuity equals wisdom. She argued that many institutions remember selectively. They remember what protects them, not what redeems them. In her view, disruption is sometimes the only way to force honest reevaluation. Stability without justice, she implied, is just stagnation with better branding. The room felt heavier now, not louder. This was not the energy of confrontation, but of exposure. Viewers watching at home were no longer choosing heroes. They were recognizing trade-offs they had been shielded from by simpler narratives. That recognition is uncomfortable, but irreversible. Then came the moment where humor slipped in, almost by accident. Cruz remarked dryly that every policy now seems marketed as the last chance to save civilization. The comment drew a restrained chuckle, even from staffers trained to remain neutral. Ocasio-Cortez replied that civilization has apparently survived many last chances already. The levity did not undercut the seriousness. It humanized it. Humor, when used sparingly, punctures absolutism. It reminds audiences that certainty is often performative. But it also carries risk, because humor lowers defenses. Lowered defenses invite scrutiny. And scrutiny is dangerous terrain for anyone relying on moral authority alone. The exchange then pivoted toward personal credibility, not character attacks, but consistency. Cruz questioned whether revolutionary rhetoric can coexist with incremental governance. Ocasio-Cortez questioned whether incrementalism has any credibility left. Both questions landed because they targeted unresolved contradictions rather than personalities. What became clear was that this was not a debate about left versus right. It was about speed versus stability, visibility versus durability, moral clarity versus institutional resilience. These tensions do not resolve, they cycle. As the segment closed, neither side appeared victorious, but both appeared altered. The audience had been invited into a layer of politics usually reserved for private rooms. Once invited, they cannot be uninvited. And that, more than any soundbite, is what unsettles power the most. What followed was not escalation, but calculation. The kind that happens when participants realize the audience has shifted from reactive to evaluative. Once that shift occurs, performance becomes dangerous, because exaggeration is no longer read as passion, but as insecurity. Both sides sensed it at the same time, even if neither acknowledged it openly. The air changed from confrontation to accounting. This is the phase of political conflict, where motives are no longer inferred, but audited. Viewers stop asking who is right and begin asking who benefits. That question has a corrosive effect on moral certainty. It does not accuse, it interrogates. And interrogation demands restraint. One side began speaking more slowly, choosing words that carried fewer absolutes. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. When leaders sense reputational risk, cadence becomes cautious. Certainty gives way to conditional language. This is not weakness. It is self-preservation. The other side leaned into specificity, not to overwhelm, but to anchor. Specificity limits misinterpretation. It also limits improvisation, which is why it is often avoided. But once credibility becomes the contested terrain, abstraction stops working. Details become currency. At this point, the debate stopped being about ideology and started being about trust horizons. How long can the public be expected to trust institutions without visible course correction? How often can urgency be invoked before it loses potency? How many exceptions can be justified before rules cease to function as rules? These questions do not have partisan answers. A revealing moment arrived when one participant acknowledged, almost reluctantly, that optics matter whether anyone likes it or not. That admission landed heavier than any accusation. Politics pretends to disdain optics while being governed by them. To admit this publicly is to expose the machinery behind the curtain. Exposure creates vulnerability, but it also creates credibility. The response to that admission was not denial, but reframing. Optics, it was argued, are not manipulation, but translation. Complex systems require narratives to be understood at scale. The danger lies not in simplification, but in selective emphasis. What is omitted often matters more than what is said. Here, the debate brushed against something uncomfortable. Narrative control is not inherently deceptive. Every institution relies on framing to function. The question is whether framing serves clarity or shields power from consequence. That distinction is rarely interrogated publicly because it implicates everyone. The audience reaction was muted but focused. This was no longer content designed for applause. It demanded attention rather than emotion. Attention is harder to sustain, but far more consequential. It signals seriousness. A moment of restrained humor surfaced again, this time darker. Someone remarked that every generation believes it is living through unprecedented dysfunction. The implication was clear. If everything is unprecedented, nothing is learnable. The laughter that followed was uneasy, not dismissive. That unease mattered. It suggested recognition rather than relief. Recognition that many of the failures being debated were structural, not personal. Structural failures do not resolve through exposure alone. They require patience, which is politically expensive. As the exchange continued, both sides began referencing long-term consequences more frequently, not as warnings, but as costs already accruing. Erosion of institutional trust. Polarization, hardening into identity. A public increasingly fluent in outrage but exhausted by resolution. One participant raised the issue of personal sustainability. How long can leaders maintain constant rhetorical intensity without losing coherence? Movements burn fuel, whether they advance or stall. Burn too fast, and nothing is left when adaptation is needed. This was not a critique, but a caution. The reply reframed exhaustion as evidence of resistance. Power rarely yields without friction. Burnout, in this view, is not failure, but proof of pressure. The challenge is not avoiding exhaustion, but ensuring it produces change rather than collapse. That distinction is thin and dangerous. By now, the debate had become introspective without becoming conciliatory. Neither side softened their core position, but both acknowledged limits they could not fully control. This acknowledgement did not resolve disagreement. It made it more honest. The media response reflected this shift. Headlines grew less dramatic and more analytical. Producers extended segments rather than cutting for reaction. This was not because conflict had diminished, but because complexity had increased. Complexity slows virality, but deepens impact. Behind the scenes, staffers were already recalculating. Which sound bites would age well? Which lines would be replayed in a year without embarrassment? Which moments signaled leadership and which signaled impulse? These calculations shape careers more than any vote. As the exchange moved toward its later stages, something unexpected happened. The audience began projecting themselves into the conflict, not as partisans, but as stakeholders. What would they accept in the name of progress? What risks would they tolerate in the name of stability? This is the moment debates become consequential. When viewers stop watching and start evaluating their own thresholds. Thresholds for trust, thresholds for disruption, thresholds for disappointment. Neither side offered closure, and that absence was not accidental. Closure implies resolution. Resolution implies finality. Politics rarely affords either. What remained instead was tension without theatrics, a recognition that power is maintained not by winning arguments, but by managing trade-offs. Trade-offs are unsatisfying. They resist slogans, but they are where governance actually lives. The final stage did not arrive with a bang. It arrived with weight, the kind of weight that settles after the noise fades, when everyone involved understands that whatever just happened will not be undone by a press release, a follow-up interview, or a trending hashtag. This was no longer about who landed the sharper line or who commanded the room. It was about consequences that would unfold quietly, unevenly, and over time. By this point, the audience had changed again. The casual viewers were gone. What remained were people trying to understand what this confrontation meant for how power actually works in America when rhetoric collides with reality. They were not looking for heroes. They were looking for patterns. One pattern became impossible to ignore. Moral certainty, when repeated often enough, begins to sound like insulation. Not insulation against criticism, but insulation against learning. When leaders speak only in absolutes, they remove the possibility of correction without humiliation. And humiliation is the fastest way to radicalize disagreement. This realization hung over the closing moments like an unspoken verdict. Neither side said it directly. They didn't need to. The audience could see it in the careful pacing, the absence of rhetorical fireworks, the way both speakers seemed aware that every word now carried archival weight. Nothing here would be forgotten quickly. Power rarely collapses in dramatic moments. It erodes through accumulation. Small contradictions left unaddressed. Promise reframed instead of evaluated. Symbols elevated beyond their capacity to deliver outcomes. The confrontation had dragged these contradictions into the open without resolving them. One side faced the quiet cost of overextension. When a political identity becomes inseparable from moral urgency, every compromise looks like betrayal. That is not a sustainable posture in a system built on negotiation. Urgency is an accelerant, not a structure. It can ignite movements, but it cannot govern them. The other side faced a different reckoning. Precision and data can dismantle arguments, but they do not automatically rebuild trust. Winning a debate does not guarantee legitimacy in the eyes of those who feel unseen by the system. Numbers explain outcomes. They do not soothe resentment. That gap matters. This was the quiet symmetry of the moment. Both positions were strong in isolation and incomplete in application. One articulated moral vision without operational friction. The other emphasized operational limits without fully addressing moral discontent. The audience understood this, even if commentators avoided saying it aloud. As the exchange wound down, the most revealing shift was not in language, but in posture. The aggressive forward lean disappeared. Shoulders relaxed. Hands stopped slicing the air. These were not gestures of defeat, but of recalibration. The body often accepts reality before the mind admits it. Questions from observers became more pointed, but less emotional. Instead of asking who was right, they asked what happens next. What happens when ambitious policy meets institutional inertia? What happens when voters lose patience with both promises and constraints? What happens when outrage outpaces outcomes? Those questions did not belong to either side alone. They belonged to the system itself. And systems do not respond to speeches. They respond to incentives, pressures, and adaptation over time. This is the part of politics that rarely fits into clips. A subtle moment underscored this shift. One participant acknowledged that some of the most damaging failures were unintended. That admission was not dramatic. It was devastating in its simplicity. Unintended consequences are harder to defend against than malicious ones, because intention offers no immunity from impact. People live with outcomes, not motives. They remember what happened to their jobs, their communities, their sense of stability. They do not remember footnotes or explanations. That gap between intention and impact defines political aftershocks. The discussion briefly touched on legacy, not in grand historical terms, but in quieter ones. How will this moment be remembered 5 years from now? Will it be cited as a turning point or just another skirmish? Legacy is shaped less by what is said than by what follows. Silence followed that question, not awkward silence, reflective silence, the kind that signals understanding rather than confusion. It was clear that neither side could control the answer. Outside the room, reactions began diverging. Some viewers saw vindication. Others saw warning. Many saw exhaustion. Exhaustion with extremes, with repetition, with the sense that every debate feels existential while producing incremental change. This exhaustion is politically dangerous. It creates space for disengagement. Disengagement is not neutral. It benefits those already entrenched. That paradox hovered over the entire exchange like a shadow. There was a moment when humor surfaced again, but this time it was self-directed. A remark about how every generation rediscovers the limits of idealism the hard way. The laughter was brief. No one lingered on it. It wasn't relief, it was recognition. Recognition that ambition without calibration leads to backlash. Recognition that skepticism without empathy leads to alienation. Recognition that power is maintained not by purity, but by adaptation. These are not slogans. They are lessons learned slowly and often too late. As the exchange formally concluded, there was no victory lap, no dramatic exit, no final line designed for replay. Just a procedural ending that felt almost anticlimactic. That anticlimax was the point. The real consequences would unfold elsewhere. In future votes, shaped by quieter hesitation. In donors recalculating risk. In activists debating strategy behind closed doors. In voters deciding whether to lean in or tune out. This is how political gravity works. It pulls long after the initial motion ends. The spectacle fades, but the orbit changes. Subtly at first, then permanently. One of the most overlooked outcomes was how this moment reframed credibility. Credibility is not about being flawless. It is about being corrigible. Audiences are more forgiving of error than of denial. That truth cuts across ideology. Those who appeared unwilling to acknowledge limits lost something intangible, but significant. Those who acknowledged limits without surrender gained a different kind of authority. Not dominance. Durability. Durability is the currency of long political careers. The audience sensed that distinction instinctively. They did not need to agree with conclusions to recognize discipline. They did not need to share values to respect restraint. In an era saturated with maximalism, restraint stands out. By the time analysts began framing the moment as a turning point, the turning had already happened. Not in policy, in perception. Perception determines which ideas are granted patience and which are dismissed as performative. That shift is subtle but decisive. This was not the end of a debate between two individuals. It was a snapshot of a larger tension within American politics, between aspiration and execution, between narrative and infrastructure, between moral urgency and systemic friction. Those tensions will not resolve neatly. They never do. But moments like this recalibrate the conversation. They force a reckoning with trade-offs that slogans try to obscure. They remind audiences that power is complex precisely because reality is. In the days that followed, commentary tried to simplify what had happened. Simplification is comforting. It creates villains and victors. But the audience that mattered most was no longer satisfied with comfort. They had seen too much. They had seen conviction tested by consequence. They had seen precision challenged by human cost. They had seen how easily good intentions collide with stubborn realities. And they had seen that no side emerges untouched by that collision. This is where the story truly ends. Not with resolution, but with clarity. Clarity about limits. Clarity about costs. Clarity about the fact that governing is not a performance, even when it is performed. The final takeaway was not an instruction, but a warning. When politics becomes theater alone, reality eventually storms the stage. When policy is sold without stress testing, someone else pays the price. And when audiences stop believing that anyone is listening, they stop showing up. That is the risk beneath every ideological clash. Not that one side will lose, but that the system will. And systems, once hollowed out, do not announce their collapse. They simply stop working when needed most. What lingered after the cameras shut off was not anger. It was gravity. The understanding that words can move crowds, but only decisions shape lives. That distinction is easy to forget and hard to relearn. In the end, no one walked away untouched. And that may have been the most honest outcome possible.